Good afternoon. I'm so honored to speak in your presence, eminent artists. I describe myself also as a word artist, but there are so many in the audience seated before me whom I honor for what they do in the arts. I'm Dominica Dipio, a missionary sister of Mary, Mother of the Church. I have had the privilege of studying in Rome under the Jesuits at the Pontifical Gregorian University. When I came to Rome and I returned to Uganda, one thing my colleagues noticed about me was that I took something back home. I was told when I wrote literary criticism that, sister, there is something different the way you write this time. It's not like what it was when you left. So I take it that the 4 years of studying under Jesuit spirituality and charism, and particularly having all what we did informed by the social teachings of the church, helped me without even knowing that perhaps I'm writing consciously or practicing my art consciously as a Catholic. For me, it's very difficult when the question of, are you writing as a Catholic? Are African writers writing as Catholics? It was very difficult for me to answer affirmatively, but I do know that there is a lot about Catholic ethics, Catholic aesthetics that also resonate with what African writers do. So in attempting to answer this question, I'm going to take you through a terrain of what we consider important in African writing. And one of them really is a very important meeting that happened in 1962 in Uganda. That was around the time of, that was a time when many African countries were either on the verge of their political independence or they had just got political independence. So there was this gathering of African writers of the English expression that took place in Makerere, Uganda, the university where I currently teach. It happened to be the premier university of the region then. So these writers gathered there to try to discuss about what African aesthetics is all about. And the issue of the language question came in because, as you notice, Africa is a multiple nation in terms of language. So the issue of what language will constitute African literature came in, and what was fully agreed on, there were two versions. One was represented by, let me just say, Chinua Achebe, and another by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that, by writing in the colonial language, we are not growing African literature. And then, now when you want to grow African literature in a continent that is linguistically diverse, what language are you going to use? That was a key question. And Achebe's view is that, English is a heritage we got from the colonial experience, and it is strong enough to carry the African experience. And so Africans write, modern African writing is mostly in all of these phonic languages that are part of the heritage of their colonial experience, whether it is English, French, Portuguese, not Spanish. Yeah, but that's it. And African writers, maybe Spanish, right? All right, thank you. And African writers, though, have excelled in using these languages but with a strong flavor of what is Africa in this language. And you cannot miss it that you are given a good dose of an African experience through this literature, even if it's written in any one of these languages. So although Africa then is a geographical location, when it comes to issues of the language and literature, one thing is clear, that what matters so much is the experience of the African people. And from the experience, you can actually trace, there is a certain aesthetic that you can name and call African, even if it is this diverse. The second issue that I want to draw attention to is another conference also, which we call in the region a revolution, which happened also in Nairobi in 1968. All these are around the time of giving birth, if you like, to modern African literature, which, as you notice, is already taking the tone of being extremely political. And the question here was, what is African literature? The discussion was led again by young Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Taban Loliyong, and one other African, hotheads. Yes, thank you. And the definition of African literature up to that point was the English department, was the name given to literature, the English department. And so these revolutionaries said, no, it cannot be the English department. If it is the English department, then what we consider foundational to African literature gets off, which is orature or oral literature, if you like. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o and his friends within East Africa changed the name of the English department to the Department of Literature. And so now I teach in the Department of Literature, which is a department that foregrounds literature in English language, but literature of other parts of the world as well, not just the English literature. So this was an effort at shifting the center from England to, other literatures, and bringing African literature, specifically orature, as part of the beginning point of defining what is African literature. So if you notice in our collection of essays, I chose to share an oral form, African folk tale for what I shared in our collection. This is because, that for us we take as the foundational point of African literary aesthetics, that orature came from being on the periphery to the center. And in my university, the project of oral literature is very, very important. And in many other African countries, orature is a very important component. And in fact, the coinage, orature, is even said to have, derived from a Ugandan, Pio Zirimo, who named that, because you can't exclude the oral when you are dealing with African literature. So that's one of the aesthetics I consider, bringing what was considered marginal to the center, if you like. Another important component of African writing, from my understanding, is the importance of the past then. Past, the tradition, the history, memory of the past. And why is the issue of memory so important? Ngugi wrote an essay called Remembering, R-E separated from membering. This is because of, at the backdrop of modern African literature is the experience of colonialism, of course, and imperial culture, which is considered to have really dismantled Africa culturally, and so the African writers, have taken the responsibility to remember and to go back to the past mostly, to be inspired also by the experiences of the past. And, in the words of Chinua Achebe, to remember really where the rain began to beat us so that you know how to move forward. The connection then between past, present, and projection into the future, in my perspective, is a very important agenda in African writing. Again, this connectedness that we have had this morning is what African writers take so seriously. And I see in this connectedness really picking up a people who, in the era of colonialism, were made to actually denigrate their culture and to consider whatever was African as negative, to pick it up and to rethink who they are. I want to make reference to the importance of religion, the encounter especially between Christianity and African traditional religion is big in most African literature. And I want to make reference to two categories of missionaries, especially in the example given by Chinua Achebe that we see in African writing. One who is really rigid and legalistic and who does not create any room for cultural dialogue. And there is the other missionary who is, very open to discussion, to understand the difference between this culture and that. And in the process, what initially appears to be very different and not converging, when open to discussion, you see so many lines of convergence. I would like to think that other than differences, yes, differences are there, but there are also so many points of convergence between African culture and Christianity. And I recall one poem by a Ugandan writer who said, these people were praying for rain. They went to the church and prayed, and then they also went to the shrine and prayed, and then it rained. In the process, it was difficult to say which of these two gods let it to rain. So the whole point here is the invitation really to dialogue between the different understandings of God, who is actually one. It's time? Already? Okay, quickly. I want to say that African writing is really gritty. Its feet is on the ground. It's very disturbing. It's very realistic. The African writer sees himself as a member of the community, and he writes with and for the community. The whole point of being elitist is, in most African writing, is, especially prose writing this time, is not very, very strong because the artist is a member of the community. And I want to think this comes also from the understanding of the griotic tradition of storytelling, where the griot is really somebody inserted inside the community and knows the community. And he is a teacher, a philosopher, a historian, and indeed, the intellectual mind of African society resides very much in the artist. Is that where you want me to stop? Thank you. All right. Yeah.
I was hoping that she would keep time so that I can ask her some questions afterward. But I said this before to Father Mark, that to title the panel "Africa and the Catholic Imagination" is a tall order, because Africa is a great diversity, and I don't know whether we go back to St. Augustine and come this far. No, can't do that. So, and I thought of touching just about 4 points, maybe. The first one was, I don't know whether to think Catholic faith and African imagination. And I think some of you might know the book that was written in honor of Father Adrian Hastings, because he's a Jesuit, probably people know him. And the book is called Christianity and the African Imagination. Why would this be a perspective to consider? Because I think it helps to appreciate how Africans embraced the faith, made it theirs, and let it inform their cultures. Why? Because our oral traditions and our oral transmission of knowledge capture a lot of symbols, proverbs, sayings that really are very comfortable with scripture to some extent. Maybe not with the lifestyle of missionaries, but with scripture itself. I think so. When you think rituals and the celebration of sacraments, African people are very comfortable with that because our life transmission goes through rituals also. Yeah. I tell my friends who are from the West that be careful when you're buying masks in the arts market, because every mask means something. Every mask is a window to a transcendental world, so you have to know which mask transmits which transcendental order to be able to. There are always veils of some reality. Yes, I think ordinary people, because of their ordinary customs, were able to incorporate, to embrace the faith and to some extent live by it, because their existential and transcendental matters found some convergence with the dimensions of the faith. Now, that said, when we come to literature, I think I'm the wrong person in the wrong place, because I'm not a writer, I'm not a novelist, I'm not a poet, but I really like literature. When it comes to the writers, I think the inevitable colonial context of Catholic evangelization is a force to reckon with. Yeah. Africans the African writers of the 50s to the 70s, I picked two. I'll mention them. I won't read anything from their works because of time constraint. Yeah. I would like to mention Mongo Betty, who is a Cameroonian author who wrote a book called The Poor Christ of Bomba, which was, the main character is a missionary priest in that area. The book was published in 1956. And then he speaks of this priest who wanted to convert everyone, but especially the community that was most resistant to the missionary lifestyle and the church structures. So he succeeds to some extent, but whenever he goes away, they go back to their... So it's like the back and forth, which was for the community a resistance to the point that they could see the colonial power using religion as a colonial tool. So Mongo Betty described that very well, and you can see also how he described how ordinary people also make good use of the faith precisely to make sense of all this suffering they are going through because of the colonial power and how to survive it. So it's an interesting book, together with the one of Ferdinand Oyono, who is also a Cameroonian. Ferdinand Oyono writes from a different angle. The character of his book, The Old Man and the Medal, is that the old man is a chief who's given land for the colonial power and for the Catholic mission. And his sons, two of his sons went to fight in the World War, and they died there. So the French colonial administration came with pomp to give him a medal, because of how much he has given, including his own sons. So then the ceremony goes well, but then people get drunk and he loses the medal, and then he's the laugh of everyone because like you gave land and you gave your own children, and what you get is a medal that you even lost. Yeah? So it's a satire that is present in practically, I would say, almost all African writers of those early days, maybe not the 2000s, but in those closer to. Then the last author I want to talk about is Valentin Mudimbe. I like Mudimbe because he's a Congolese. But a Congolese who wrote a book that won the Grand Prix for International Catholic Literature in 1975. And the book is Between the Tides. And he described the tension of a young priest who, at the moment of the process of independence, there is like torn between two possibilities. I go to cater for the rebels, yeah, because they are also baptized, yeah, and I'm going to celebrate Mass for them and administer the sacraments and support them. And then the power structure behind his mission, that like, if you go, you are kind of betraying us to some extent, but you are for the souls here, not for the political power. So the tension is quite interesting. And anyway, it's the tragedy, the drama that this priest goes through, because he goes with the rebels, and the conversation he has when he is explaining to people why they have to continue praying within this whole context. It's quite interesting. Yeah. Then I would go to the point number 3, which is a curious parallelism between two different writers. Ousmane Sembene, who is a Senegalese, who writes about there was this big project of French government to build railways from Dakar to Bamako in Mali. And then, but the people were so mistreated, they are trying to fight, and they organize a strike to reclaim their. He's a Senegalese Muslim, no religious connotation to the tragedy he's describing. But you see that there is something of the faith of the people, because they are not all Muslim, and they're trying to, why are they fighting? It's because we want to recover some of our dignity that these people in the faith defend and proclaim. How can we not use it also to try and recover our own? So the men who are building the railways at some point are not so keen to continue the strike, and their wives say, we have to continue. If you don't do it, we'll do it, and we go ahead of you. And so it starts, this book, I put it in parallel to the one of Margaret Ogola, The River and the Source. I gave Father Mark a copy of that one because it's an interesting book. This one, 1994. But The River and the Source, Margaret is trying to show how we keep our traditions even today. Yeah? What's the role of women in our communities and their place, the role of the men. It's not about any toxic patriarchy. It's like the correct complementarity between men and women in the bringing up our civilization. But the interesting part about Margaret Ogola's book is that I have known personally 4 people who have come back to the Catholic faith or joined the Catholic faith from other religions because of this book. So to me, it's a book that, without pretending to be a Catholic evangelizing book, because it's written with a Catholic perspective, it brings people to God. And it's fascinating because some of these people I know have been my students, and there are people who are lawyers and medical doctors. And so you can see, but why I put it together with Ousmane Sembene, it's because of the dignity of the women. Yeah? From Sembene, with a veiled kind of religious conviction behind that, but immigrant Ogolas, an open one, but rooted also in the convergence between our traditions and the claims of the Catholic faith. And then the book is a very interesting reading, short, but very interesting. So at least you can see that faith and culture, even if the cultures are pagan, there is something in paganism that calls for God. Yeah? And I wanted to say something about Charles Péguy here, because Charles Péguy explains that the Greek and Roman pagan cultures, without knowing it, prepared the way for the incarnation of the Son of God. So the Roman soldier prepared the cradle of where the Son of God was, and the Greek rationality, the logos. I won't go far from there, but you can see. So it's more or less the same thing in the colonization using the church, because in Congo it used the church. In the Congo, the King Leopold used missions to raise money to support the colonial system. Yeah, so we can't, but that horrendous endeavor that came with some kind of political imperialism and spiritual imperialism, if you want, is something that in the end prepared the cradle for a faith that is vibrant today on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have exhausted our time, but if there is any comment or question, we will be happy to take just 2 minutes. Then we leave this space.
I'm just wondering, I imagine it's difficult to generalize in talking about African literature. It must be, is it like talking about European literature where I can't think of anything more different than, I don't know, Hungarian and English, and so is it a kind of a strain to try and group everything together in the term African?
Yes, to a certain extent, yes. But when you look at this literature as the experience of a people that have gone through certain phases, that there are several things that unite. If you like to trace from the history of imperialism, slavery, these are things that feature in our literature. And now to the post-colonial experience of African leaders, neocolonialism, all of these things. So when I teach a course called the African Novel, this is a problem. You just say, where do you start from? And then you look at traces that cut across the continent. And indeed, you find them from the level of experience. And then, of course, aesthetics. Just as it says, heavily satirical, whether it is a satire of, missionary experience, or it is of current political leaders and so on. It's you see those trends. Thanks.
I think I agree with you, because there is a problem. It happens to me with my colleagues when I'm talking about philosophy, because we talk about African philosophy, I always say that a philosophy doesn't have a nationality. Right? If it is philosophy, it's philosophy here, there, and in fact, we have built knowledge borrowing from so many different ones that you cannot really ascribe to them a continent or a nationality. So I believe that to some extent, even literature has to come to terms with this fact that you can't nationalize it, you can't limit it to some political boundaries, because I think that in the end, the boundaries of a nation state are political, not artistic. Yeah.
Totally agree. That is why you see our African writers read across the globe also. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm wondering if there is still a robust, vibrant oral literary tradition ongoing, or whether when you speak about the oral tradition, it is more about respecting the history of that tradition and its importance as a literary tradition in Africa.
Yeah, there is oral literature tradition. I just want to say very, very little in the interest of time about my experience of collecting folk tales and having these folk tales come to class and having these folk tales turn into animation films, for instance. This is a whole journey of bringing oral tradition and putting it in a more modern digital genre because you want the continuity of these values which will otherwise get lost. And I also want to say that there is a group of African poets. They call themselves word artists. It's becoming extremely popular in our cities today, that most of them ascribe to poetry using the image of the African traditional griot and mixing it with the modern to speak urgently to issues of contemporary times. So it is a practice that is evolving and it's changing with the needs of the time, but it's coming from the roots of the tradition. Thank you.
I think to that we could add that Africa is still majorly, at least sub-Saharan Africa, it's majorly rural. And the ones who are interested in this kind of aesthetics are racing against time because they can still recover that not just tradition, but the fact of transmitting knowledge orally. And I say we are racing against time because we want to record before the artists disappear, because the artists, some of them are very old, elderly people, but I would just use one example so as not to extend this. When people go for a ceremony to ask for the hand of a daughter in a family or pay the dowry, there is a way of doing this, and there are very specific forms of doing this orally. This is still there, and if Yvonne can write about such a thing, she can still record what the oral tradition transmits as not only the style or the way, it's not just the how, but also the what. Yeah. You don't ask the hand of a woman just anyhow. Yeah? So there is a whole knowledge on how to do this, or how to name the children, or how to decide the destiny of this community in the next few years to come. So it's still there, yeah? Majorly in the rural area, but there where we have the major part of our population so far. Yeah.
To end this session, we have eaten into the next time. We will continue the conversation out of here. Thank you.